Let me tell you something people don't like to admit. When someone leaves your life, you don't always miss them right away. In fact, at first, you feel a little space, a little silence, maybe even a little pride. You tell yourself, I'm good. I don't need that anymore. You act like nothing changed, but give it time, because time has a way of doing something your ego can't stop. It reveals what your emotions try to ignore. And here's where it gets real. When someone like that steps back, when their presence is no longer filling your everyday moments, something starts to happen in the background. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, almost invisible at first, but powerful. You start noticing the space they used to occupy. You start feeling the silence where their energy used to be. And little by little, what you once overlooked begins to speak louder than what you replaced it with. That's when it hits. It was never just about having them around. It was about what their presence was doing for your life without you even realizing it. And now that they're not there, time starts breaking the illusion. When you step back from someone's life, something very interesting begins to happen that most people don't talk about honestly. At first, they don't react the way you expect. They don't panic. They don't immediately run after you. They don't suddenly realize everything overnight. No, human emotion doesn't usually work in dramatic explosions like that. It works in slow realizations, in quiet moments, in pauses between distractions. And that's where the truth starts to reveal itself, because absence has a strange effect on people. It doesn't just create space, it creates reflection. And reflection is uncomfortable for anyone who is used to your presence being constant, available, predictable. When you're always there, people don't always evaluate what always there actually means. They don't calculate your effort. They don't measure your consistency. They don't think about the emotional weight you were carrying just to keep things smooth. They simply get used to it. But the moment you step back, something shifts. Not immediately in their behavior, but in their awareness. At first, they feel relief or normalcy. They think, okay, everything is fine. They continue their routine. They continue their habits. They continue acting like nothing has changed. But time has a way of quietly exposing what attention was covering. Because attention is powerful, but it's also distracting. When someone has your attention, they don't have to face the absence of it. They don't have to sit with the emotional contrast of what life feels like without you. But when you remove yourself, even gently, even silently, even without explanation, you introduce contrast into their world. And contrast is what creates clarity. Now they start noticing small things, not big dramatic breakdowns at first. Small things. The message they expected but didn't receive. The voice they got used to hearing that is no longer there. The presence they took for granted in everyday moments. It's subtle. It's almost unnoticeable at first. But the mind doesn't ignore patterns for long. Eventually it starts connecting dots. And this is where it gets real. Because absence doesn't just make the heart grow fonder like people casually say. That's a simplified version. What it really does is force someone to sit with reality without comfort. When you're present, you often absorb emotional tension. You smooth things over. You fill gaps. You carry the emotional weight that keeps things functioning. But when you leave that space, even if it's just emotional distance, that structure starts to feel different, and now they're left with silence. And silence is powerful, because silence does not entertain excuses. Silence does not soften truth. Silence simply exists. And in that existence, people are left alone with their thoughts. That's when the reflection begins. They start remembering moments differently. Things they overlooked suddenly feel more important. Conversations they didn't fully value start replaying in their mind. Your patience starts to look different in hindsight. Your effort starts to stand out in memory. And the interesting part is, none of it changed. You didn't become more valuable overnight. They simply stopped taking it for granted in real time, because appreciation often doesn't happen in presence. It happens in absence. And this is where clarity is born, not from what you say, not from what you explain, but from what they experience when you are no longer filling the space you used to fill. That empty space becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, they don't just see you, they see what you meant to their emotional balance, their routine, their comfort, their sense of connection. But clarity is not always comfortable. In fact, most clarity arrives with discomfort attached, because now they're forced to acknowledge something they didn't want to admit before. They had access to something meaningful, and they didn't fully recognize it while it was present. And here's the deeper truth. This is not about manipulation or punishment. It's about human nature. People don't evaluate value when it is constantly available. They evaluate value when it is missing. That is how perspective works. That is how emotional awareness develops. Meanwhile, you are also going through your own transformation in that same distance. Because stepping back doesn't just affect them, it also reveals you to yourself. You start realizing what you were overgiving. You start seeing where you were over-investing. You start understanding where your presence was being stretched too thin. And that awareness changes you. So while they are sitting in reflection, you are stepping into recognition. And that is where power shifts without conflict, without argument, without explanation, because now the situation is no longer about chasing understanding. It is about observing truth unfold naturally. And truth, when left alone long enough, always becomes visible, and that is why absence is not empty. It is revealing. Time has a way of telling the truth that emotions refuse to admit in the moment. When something ends, or when distance is created, people often think the story is already written. They assume they understand what happened, why it happened, and what it means. But time doesn't agree with assumptions. Time tests them. It stretches them. It removes the noise and leaves only what can survive without distraction. In the beginning, when someone loses your presence, they don't immediately face truth. They face reaction. They distract themselves. They tell themselves stories that feel easier to carry. It's fine, they'll come back, I don't care. These are not truths. They are emotional cushions. They are ways of avoiding the discomfort of sitting with absence. But time doesn't let avoidance stay comfortable for long, because as days pass, distractions lose their intensity. The initial emotional noise settles. The mind starts to slow down. And when the mind slows down, memory gets louder. Not the dramatic memories, but the quiet ones. The ordinary moments, the consistency. The way you showed up without needing recognition. The way you handled things that others overlook. The way your presence created emotional structure in their life without them realizing it. And that is where truth begins to form, not in the peak of emotion, but in the absence of it. Time has no loyalty to pride. It doesn't protect ego. It doesn't reinforce denial. It simply continues forward, and in doing so, it forces people to sit with what they tried to avoid. Because when you are no longer present to fill emotional gaps, those gaps don't disappear. They become noticeable. At first, it's subtle. A moment of silence feels a little longer than usual. A routine feels slightly incomplete. A message that used to come consistently now creates expectation in its absence. These are small cracks in emotional comfort, but over time, cracks expand. And that expansion is where realization begins. Because what people often fail to understand is that emotional impact is not measured in intensity, it is measured in consistency. Anyone can be impressive in moments, but not everyone can be steady over time. And time is the only thing that exposes that difference clearly. So when you are no longer there, time begins to reveal what your consistency actually meant. Not in theory, but in lived experience. It shows how much emotional stability you were contributing. It shows how much energy you were investing. It shows how much of the connection was being quietly sustained by your effort. And once that realization starts forming, It cannot be easily reversed because truth, once seen, doesn't disappear. It may be resisted, but it remains present in awareness. That's why people often go through phases. First denial, then reflection, then recognition. They don't arrive at understanding instantly. They arrive through layers of time. In denial, they minimize your importance. In reflection, they question their assumptions. In recognition, they finally see clearly what was always there. But here's the part that most people misunderstand. Time doesn't create new value. It reveals existing value that was previously ignored. It doesn't make you more important than you were. It simply removes the distractions that prevented recognition. And that's why absence feels different as time passes. It doesn't feel like a single moment of loss. It feels like a gradual understanding of what was actually present all along. Meanwhile, emotionally, the mind begins to replay things differently. Conversations that once seemed casual now carry weight. Gestures that were overlooked now feel meaningful. Support that was once expected now feels rare. And what is happening here is not changing you. It is changing perception. Because perception is heavily influenced by presence. When someone is there, the mind normalizes them. When someone is gone, the mind reevaluates them. That reevaluation is where emotional truth begins to surface. Time also has another effect. It removes comparison noise. When you are present, people often compare you unconsciously to other distractions in their life. But when you are absent, there is no comparison left in that space. Only memory remains, and memory without interference becomes more honest over time. That is why sometimes distance creates clarity that closeness never could. Not because distance is powerful on its own, but because it removes everything except reflection. And in that reflection, people begin to understand emotional weight. They realize how certain presences cannot be easily replaced. Not because no one else exists, but because not everyone carries the same emotional depth, consistency, or connection energy. At the same time, time also exposes emotional dependency that was ignored before. People often don't realize how much they relied on someone until that support structure is gone. Not in a weak sense, but in a human sense. Emotional habits form quietly, and when those habits are interrupted, the absence feels louder than expected. This is where discomfort becomes truth's messenger, because discomfort forces attention, and attention forces awareness, and awareness forces honesty. So over time, what begins as absence turns into understanding. What begins as silence turns into reflection. And what begins as separation turns into clarity. But clarity is not always comfortable to receive. It often arrives after the moment of opportunity has passed. And that is the paradox of time. It reveals truth when reaction is no longer possible, only recognition. And that is why time doesn't just heal or hurt, it exposes. There is a point in life where you stop measuring your worth through how much effort you give to people who barely meet you halfway. It's not an overnight decision, and it's not born out of anger. It comes from experience, from exhaustion, from realizing that you can't keep pouring into spaces that never refill you. That is where the shift begins, not in what you say, but in what you stop tolerating. Because for a long time, you may believe that love, connection, or loyalty is proven through how much you give. You overextend yourself. You explain more than necessary. You stay longer than you should. You forgive quicker than you heal. And slowly, without realizing it, you start building your identity around being available, being understanding, being the one who holds things together. But here is the truth. Most people only learn after emotional fatigue sets in. Value is not created by overgiving. In fact, overgiving often hides value instead of revealing it. Because when you constantly adjust, constantly accommodate, constantly stay flexible for people who are not doing the same for you, you don't appear more valuable. You appear more accessible. And accessibility without boundaries is where appreciation starts to disappear. So something has to shift. not in a dramatic way, but in a grounded way. You begin to pull back. You begin to observe instead of over-functioning. You begin to ask yourself a very simple but powerful question. If I stop overgiving here, what actually remains? And that question changes everything. Because when you stop chasing validation through effort, you begin to notice who was benefiting from your over-effort more than they were valuing your presence. You start seeing where you were emotionally over-invested. You start noticing where consistency only flowed one way. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. That is the beginning of becoming value instead of chasing it. Becoming value does not mean becoming distant or cold. It does not mean shutting down emotionally or withdrawing from meaningful connection. It means recalibrating where your energy goes. It means no longer confusing emotional exhaustion with loyalty. It means understanding that real connection does not require you to shrink yourself to maintain it. When you truly start valuing yourself, something subtle but powerful happens. Your decisions become quieter but more firm. You stop over-explaining your boundaries. You stop negotiating your needs. You stop trying to convince people to see what they should already recognize. And that silence is not emptiness. It is structure. Because now your energy is no longer scattered. It becomes directed. You no longer respond to every emotional pull. You no longer react to every inconsistency. You begin to observe patterns instead of participating in cycles. And this is where your presence changes shape. People who were used to your constant availability begin to notice a difference. Not because you announced it, but because they can feel it. Your responses are no longer automatic. Your emotional investment is no longer unlimited. Your attention is no longer freely distributed to situations that drain you. And interestingly, this is when perception shifts. Because when you are always available, people assume that availability is your baseline. They don't question it, they don't evaluate it. But the moment you reduce that availability, even slightly, they start to register your presence differently. Suddenly, you are not just there, you are selective. You are aware of where your energy goes, and that changes how people relate to you. Some will adjust, some will resist, some will step closer, some will step away. But all of them will now interact with a version of you that is no longer operating on automatic emotional generosity, and that is important. Because when you become value, you are no longer defined by how much you give away. You are defined by what you choose to keep. Your time becomes selective. Your energy becomes protected. Your attention becomes earned, not assumed. And in that shift, something powerful happens internally. You stop negotiating your worth in real time. You stop trying to prove that you deserve respect, consistency, or effort. You start recognizing that these are not rewards for being good enough. They are basic requirements for meaningful connection. And that realization alone changes your entire emotional posture. You begin to walk differently in relationships. Not louder, not colder, but clearer. You no longer confuse emotional intensity with emotional security. You no longer mistake attention for consistency. You no longer accept potential over behavior. You start valuing patterns more than promises. And in doing so, you become harder to manipulate emotionally. Not because you are defensive, but because you are aware. You understand now that value is not something you chase. It is something you embody. And when you embody it, you don't need to announce it. You don't need to defend it. You don't need to argue for it. People either recognize it or they don't. But you are no longer in the position of trying to convince anyone of anything. You simply stand in what you know you are worth and you move accordingly. And that is the real shift. Emotional overgiving to grounded self-respect. Silence is one of the most misunderstood forces in human relationships. People often think silence means weakness, confusion, or surrender. They assume that if you're not speaking, you're not powerful. If you're not explaining yourself, you're not being understood. If you're not defending your position, you've somehow lost your place. But in reality, silence is not absence of power. It is control of it. Because when you keep explaining yourself over and over, you are not always being heard more clearly. In many cases, you are just repeating your presence to people who have already decided how they want to perceive you. And that is where silence becomes powerful. Not because it is empty, but because it stops feeding unnecessary narratives. Silence removes your energy from conversations that don't deserve it. It removes your emotional investment from arguments that are not leading anywhere. It removes your need to constantly justify your intentions to people who are already committed to misunderstanding them. And in that removal, something interesting happens. The dynamic changes because words can be debated, words can be twisted, words can be ignored, but silence cannot be argued with. Silence simply exists and people are forced to interpret it without your influence. That interpretation becomes their responsibility, not your burden. And that is where most people underestimate silence. They think communication is always about speaking more, explaining more, proving more. But emotional maturity often reveals the opposite. The less you feel the need to explain everything, the more grounded you become internally. When you stop defending every misunderstanding, you stop feeding emotional chaos. When you stop reacting to every provocation, you stop participating in unnecessary cycles. When you stop trying to fix every perception about you, you start protecting your energy. And that protection is not coldness. It is clarity, because silence doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It means you have decided not everything deserves a response. Not every situation deserves your emotional participation. Not every misunderstanding deserves your energy. And that decision changes everything. In silence, people are left with your absence of explanation, and that absence forces reflection. They start filling the gaps with their own thoughts. They start questioning their assumptions. They start sitting with the weight of what is unresolved, not because you punished them with silence, but because you stopped carrying the emotional responsibility of constant clarification. And this is where silence becomes louder than speech, because what you don't say often creates more reflection than what you do say. Your absence of reaction becomes a mirror. People begin to see not just you, but also their own expectations, their own interpretations, their own emotional reactions. But silence also does something else. It reveals truth without interference. When you are constantly explaining yourself, you unintentionally shape how others perceive the situation. You guide their interpretation. You soften their assumptions. You try to control understanding. But when you step back and remain silent, you remove that control. And what remains is raw perception. And raw perception is often more honest than managed communication. That is why silence can feel uncomfortable for people who are used to your emotional availability, because they are no longer receiving immediate clarification. They are no longer being guided toward a softened version of reality. They are left alone with their interpretation. And interpretation without guidance often leads to realization. And realization can be uncomfortable. At the same time, silence also protects you. It prevents emotional exhaustion that comes from over-explaining yourself to people who are not truly listening. It protects your peace from being constantly interrupted by the need to justify your actions, intentions, or boundaries, because not everything needs to be defended to be valid. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is allow people to sit with what they think without rushing to correct every misunderstanding. Not because you don't care, but because you understand that constant correction does not always lead to understanding. It often leads to exhaustion. And exhaustion is not clarity. Silence, when used with emotional maturity, becomes a form of emotional discipline. It teaches you restraint. It teaches you awareness. It teaches you that your energy is not meant to be spent on every reaction, every misunderstanding, every emotional impulse. And in that discipline, your presence begins to shift. People start noticing that you are no longer emotionally reactive in the same way. You are not quick to defend. You are not quick to explain. You are not quick to chase understanding where it is not being offered in good faith. And that changes how they approach you, because silence introduces a new kind of respect, one that is not demanded but observed. People begin to realize that your energy is not easily accessible anymore. Your emotional responses are not automatic. Your engagement is intentional. An intentional presence always carries more weight than reactive presence. But perhaps the deepest truth about silence is this: it reveals what words were covering. When everything is quiet, patterns become visible, intentions become clearer, dynamics become easier to see. What was once hidden under conversation starts to surface under stillness. And that is why silence feels powerful. It removes distortion. It doesn't create confusion. It removes it. It doesn't hide truth. It reveals it. And in the end, silence is not about saying nothing. It is about saying everything that matters by refusing to say what doesn't. So here's where we land in all of this. At some point, you stop needing closure from people who didn't value your presence when it was right in front of them. You stop waiting for explanations that were never coming. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's delayed realization, because the truth is simple. If someone needs too much time to understand what you were in their life, that understanding was never fully present in the moment you were giving it. And that's not something you fix by going back. That's something you understand by moving forward. You see, life has a way of teaching lessons without repeating itself twice in the same way. Once you remove yourself from places where you were taken for granted, you don't go back to prove your value. You go forward because you finally recognize it. And while they sit with the silence you left behind, you learn something even more important. Peace doesn't come from being missed. It comes from no longer needing to be. So let time do what it does. Let it reveal. Let it expose. Let it settle everything that words could never fix. Because in the end, the strongest position you will ever stand in is not being understood too late. It's being unavailable when they finally do.